You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. Britain's Housing Minister Mark Prisk has recently said he doesn't believe the public should give money or food to the homeless. He urged the public to put a hand up rather than a hand out. He says people should call the newly launched homeless hotline when they are worried about a rough sleeper. The national hotline, backed by 500 homelessness charities, will then alert local support services about a homeless person's location and circumstances to give them help. The government say the national helpline is an alternative to handouts. In 2009, the London Mayor Boris Johnson said he would eradicate rough sleeping in the capital by 2012. But figures published by the Greater London Authority show the numbers of homeless have been rising sharply, up 43% in 2011 to 2012, compared with the previous year. Meanwhile, according to the homeless charity Shelter, there are now 52,960 homeless households in temporary accommodation. But the most recent figures from the New Policy Institute estimates there are up to 380,000 homeless people in England who are effectively hidden because they're staying with friends or family. So, should we give food or money to rough sleepers, or are we just making things worse? And what needs to be done to help homeless households in temporary accommodation? Joining me for a discussion on homelessness is Jad Adams, the chair of Night Watch, a charity caring for the homeless in South London. Anna Page is policy manager at St Mungo's, a charity helping the homeless. Andrew Farris is the founder of the homeless charity Rhythms of Life International and was himself once forced to sleep rough on the streets of London. And Ken Hurst is a journalist and chairman of TNT Multimedia Limited, a magazine publisher. So we'll begin with Jad Adams. He's the chair of Night Watch, a charity that works with the homeless in South London. Should we be giving food and money to rough sleepers?
There are a few things that you can say about giving food to people in particular. Giving money is a different matter. Giving money directly to homeless people is something we might want to get onto. But giving food, and that's something I'm certainly very much involved in, and more involved this week than ever before. There's a massive amount of food being donated over the Christmas period. Yes, we've got to give food to homeless people. One of the main things that happens when we're giving food is that we're feeding someone who may not have eaten at all that day. Now, there's no way they're going to address any of their problems, a reconciliation with family members, or their drug problems, or their alcohol problems, or whatever other problems they've got when they're hungry. Because if you're that hungry, then your main focus is going to be simply on that hunger. So the first thing we've got to do with anyone in need is to stabilise them.
Sure. Let's go to Anna Page, policy manager at St Mungo's, a charity which helps the homeless. Should we be giving food and money to rough sleepers?
Well, as Jazz already highlighted, it's a really difficult issue. I think it's really important to recognise that people who do give money to people who are sleeping on the streets do so out of a real compassion. But ultimately, we believe that actually by giving that money, it's not a sustainable solution, and it doesn't actually address the underlying causes of rough sleeping.
Andrew Farris from Rhythms of Life International. Do you think we should be giving food and money to the homeless?
I think food, yes. Money, maybe not.
And why is that?
I think the money thing, it's been asked many times that should we give money to the homeless people? I think you want to make sure that the money is going to the right place. And you can't advise anybody individually. They have a freedom to spend the money they want. And a lot of times they tend to spend the money that they don't absolutely need for anything. If you think that they're going to go and buy the food with it, maybe. But I would normally go in and buy something economy kind of label food for the homeless person if you see somebody on the street.
And Ken Hurst, chairman of TNT Media Limited, a magazine publisher. What are your thoughts?
Simple answer really. I'm not an expert like Jad or Anna. I'm a journalist, but I observe like everybody observes, and the answer just simply has to be yes, doesn't it? I mean, there's no reason why one shouldn't. As to whether one should give money or point towards other kinds of help, which seem to be Mark Prisk's point of view, the answer is, why on earth can't we do both? But more important than all of those things, surely, is that we need to tackle the root cause of all of this, which is homelessness. And, is there a need for homelessness in this day and age? My contention is not really.
Ken, if we just go back to what you said about we maybe should be giving both food and money, is there a worry about what the money will be used for, though?
Yes, of course there is. The question maybe is there, is it for us to judge? It was interesting that Anna made the point that people give out of compassion, and I'm sure that that's largely true. But we also give, out of a sense of guilt, out of a sense of our own comfort. I often in the evenings pass by a bank machine and pop my card into the hole in the wall, and there's often someone sitting there wrapped in a blanket, seeking money. And yes, I often do drop a fiver, and yes, I hope I'm being compassionate. But I'm also I'm saying on a Friday night, I'm off for a decent weekend. So this kind of assuages my guilt a little bit as well. So it's a complex issue.
Let's go to Jad Adams. What are your thoughts about what you've just heard from Ken?
Well, I'm not entirely alien to this feeling that someone else is very hard up and I'm going out to have an extremely expensive meal, so I will give them £5 or £10, and I do think they are probably going to spend it on crack cocaine, and I'm not in doing that. I am really doing it for myself, to some extent for them, and I'm thinking, well, that's what they're going to get out of it. I don't in any way think that that's an approach to the problem of homelessness at all. It's a bit of generosity. Well, we can, if we want to give someone something, then it becomes theirs, and we can't then be telling them how to use it. So if one feels generous enough to say yes, and rich enough to just pass some money around, then by all means do that thing, but don't tell people how to use it. And the issue of drugs is very important, because there is a correlation, and it's between begging and drugs. It's not between begging and homelessness. Most homeless people are not begging, but almost everyone who's begging is using drugs.
Anna Page, policy manager at St Mungo's. Is it for us to judge when we give money to homeless people?
No, I think as other people have made the point, it's down to individuals' choice as to how they use their money. Many homelessness charities are really working across London, across the country, to really address problems around alcohol and drug addiction and a whole range of other issues that are contributing to that. And actually, by giving the money that might have gone to that individual homeless person on the street, by actually giving that to a homeless charity, that enables charities to actually address the underlying causes, which I think there's a consensus is what really is the most important thing that needs to be done.
Members of the public might just feel, I'd rather give it straight to this homeless guy. I can see him right here and I can see he's going to benefit straight away. Why would I want to give it to a charity and wait for it to filter down?
Of course, that's a completely understandable point of view to be coming from. But by looking at thinking that kind of the logic of what would happen to that money immediately, we really hope through taking a approach of kind of discussion and persuasion, I guess, with people to say, actually, the reasons that you're giving it are whatever the reasons are, but you're wanting to benefit somebody. And actually, what we've seen from 40 years of working in homelessness is that by giving this sort of help, actually it's so much more likely to go on something that's actually going to exacerbate someone's situation. It might be what that person would like to choose to spend their money on at that time, but in order to address the bigger picture, by giving to a homelessness charity, you're able to really make a difference.
We're moving into this either-or territory that Mark Prisk first raised. The government seemed to be saying, rather than giving either food or money to homeless people, point them in the direction of some real help, which organisations like Night Watch and St Mungo's provide. And why wouldn't we be all for that? But it's not either or, is it? Why can't we do both? Is there a little bit of a hint here in offering the public who are a bit irritated about seeing people sleeping in commercial or retail property doorways or in their neighbourhood watch area, of saying, report them and kind of get rid of them, So, I'm just a little bit suspicious of this, should we do this or that? We should be doing all we can across all fronts to help homeless people. And I go back to the point I made at the beginning, eradicating homelessness or doing more to eradicate homelessness is really where we need to be attacking this problem.
Ken Hurst, obviously Mark Prisk was talking at the time that he was launching a homeless hotline. He's obviously got a vested interest in launching that at the time. Which do you have more faith in, giving food and money to a homeless person or a rough sleeper, or calling the homeless hotline?
I mean, I think they can amount to the same thing. In fact, I think you can call a homeless hotline. I think we need to be, just as I say, a little bit careful about what people's motives are. Is there any clearing the streets issue around this? But clearly, if someone's in distress in any way, clearly phoning a number that can offer and send some help to alleviate that distress has got to be a good thing. But I don't see it as an absolute alternative to giving somebody a helping hand with some money or some food.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Daniel Sinner. Joining me for a discussion on homelessness is Jad Adams from the homeless charity Nightwatch, Anna Page from St Mungo's, Andrew Farris from Rhythms of Life International, and Ken Hurst from TNT Multimedia. Andrew Farris from Rhythms of Life International. Is motive really important at all if what someone's doing is a good thing and helping out a homeless person?
I think absolutely. I think one can help in every way. I agree with our guest there. Absolutely, you need to be helping them in every way you can. You can't. It shouldn't be either or either. I agree with that thing. That it shouldn't be either or. I think it should be as much as you can. Money-wise, it's just that from our service users, in our line of queues, people come for food every day. They're homeless guys. They're rough sleepers. The clientele we deal with, service users we deal with every day. And they know about myself as well, because I've met a lot of them 12, 14 years ago. And I know what they're going to spend the money on. It's just that we are discouraging the public to give them money in cash, because when they do have the money, I know what they're standing in the queue with. It's not always alcohol. It's not always that. It's other things too. But what's most essential is the food, the clothing, the donations of clothing that comes in. We give it to them every day. Okay? Now, they can also make some effort too. I know if I see a homeless person sitting on the street, I would not just go back and leave £1 and go away. I would spend them. Maybe, please, guys, ask them, how are they today? Ask them their name. Get maybe personal, a little personal, in the sense that at least you know their name at least. A lot of homeless guys sitting on the street, on the sidewalks, whatever. They're sitting there and nobody even says hello to them. They need a bit of company sometimes. So getting them practical help by interacting, i.e., if you're going to say hello, you're going to find out a little bit about them. And maybe you'll go back to your home or your Google phone or your iPhone and look it up and say, look, how can I help this person other than the money? You need to find out more venues. There are places they can go to on a daily basis for showers. There are places they can go to for food. There are places that go for clothing almost on every single day of the week. Somewhere in London, in the part of London they may be catered for. Okay.
Let's go to Jad Adams. He's the chair of Nightwatch. No matter what we do, food, money, or this homeless hotline, the numbers are still going up. Yeah. Why?
Well, it isn't just a question of people in shop doorways. Those are just the very visibly homeless. Last night, for example, my charity distributed 84 food parcels and 84 presents because it's Christmas time. And of those 84 people, very few of them were homeless and roofless. Very, very, very few indeed, less than a handful. Most of them have somewhere to stay. They're in hostels or they're in squats or they're incredibly overcrowded accommodation. They all come under this umbrella of the homeless. And we are seeing an increase, a steady month-on-month increase in that number of people. So it's not just the street homeless. It's very good to feel, however, that we're also seeing a great increase in donations of food, in food banks and so on. The food that I distributed last night had been contributed by our local council, and this is the first year that everyone in the council had got together to say, let's contribute some food for poor people in our borough. and we were one of 13 charities that's been the recipient of this food collected by the big council offices.
Now, obviously you mentioned there's other types of homeless. The rough sleepers are the visibles that everyone sees when they're walking down the street. According to the latest figures out by Shelter, there are 52,960 homeless households in temporary accommodation. Why is that number also growing?
Well, mainly it's the economic crisis. People not being able to get work, or if they have got work, they've got less work than they previously had, are working less hours, or are paid less well, or whatever. People aren't able to afford their mortgages, they're not able to afford their rents, and so we're getting an increase in evictions. We're getting more people who are becoming homeless who didn't previously think that was going to be their fate, who didn't, that really wasn't in their picture of the world. That wasn't something that had happened to anyone that they knew. And so that's a bit shocking and surprising, and it requires us to apply ourselves differently to those sorts of difficulties. Anna Page from St Mungo's, is this a picture that you also recognise?
Yeah, completely. Especially in the rise in evictions, we actually published a briefing last week highlighting this very issue of the rise in evictions. And actually from the interviews that we did as part of to inform that briefing, all but one of the people we interviewed, the eviction led almost immediately to rough sleeping. So there is a clear link between evictions and rough sleeping.
What needs to be done to break that link for when someone is isolated as someone who is in trouble before they become a rough sleeper?
Well, there's a lot that can be done to prevent evictions specifically. Sure. Evictions don't happen as a one-off, not immediately as a one-off, but
overnight.
Overnight, yes. They don't happen overnight. There are a lot of warning signs that will happen. There might be complaints to landlords or from neighbours, acts of antisocial behaviour, and often these are the visible demonstrations of underlying problems. They might be mental health problems. People who might have drug or alcohol problems might be being taken advantage of by drug dealers, for example, causing antisocial behaviour in their property, and this quite often leads to eviction. There are early warning signs that can be picked up by the community, by landlords, by housing associations, and help can get in earlier. And actually, by getting help to those people earlier, the eviction can be prevented, and therefore homelessness can be prevented.
Ken Hurst, what are your thoughts?
Well, clearly there are, as our experts have said, some complex social issues around the whole question of homelessness. But I don't want to trivialise this, but I think, one must sometimes just get back to the very basics of the availability of housing in this country. And we kid ourselves that there isn't enough housing. Now, I'm kind of lucky. I work a great deal in London, but I live in a rural area where maybe homelessness isn't so apparent, although certainly exists. And I've certainly done a few calculations, as it were, on the back of a fag packet, so our experts may well challenge them, and please feel free to do so. But my calculations began around the thought that there are around about 1 million people who are reckoned to be homeless in this country, maybe more, maybe less. And, we say to ourselves there simply aren't enough houses to house them. Well, actually there are. In my neck of the woods, there are reckoned to be 4,500 empty houses. And now, roughly speaking, if you extrapolate that, that would assume that empty houses that aren't lived in or lived in for a very, very short period of time, about 250,000 of them across Britain. Say 2 people live in each. You've halved the basic housing shortage issue here. There are premises above shops that no longer stock things because shops don't stock things anymore because supply chains offer instant delivery. All those kind of issues suggest to me that there are enough houses out there. There is enough accommodation if we apply ourselves to matching that availability to some of the complex issues that I say your other guests know far more about than I do.
Ken, obviously out in the rural areas there will be other properties available. Are you in your estimations, are you including privately owned by people like you and I?
Oh, absolutely so. I mean, there are some shocking statistics out there, and I don't want to bore people with statistics, but I know one Norfolk coastal town where there are 5,000 weekend cottages. 5,000 weekend cottages. Now I'm not suggesting for a moment we can, send homeless people in to occupy them when they're sort of when their rich banker owners aren't there. But we could apply some punitive measures here. How about applying, instead of giving them tax breaks, applying £1,000 a year under occupancy penalty? That 5,000 weekend cottages would generate a building fund of what, £5 million? So attacking those basic issues, attacking those toothless gaps where architects build grand little designs for television programs. We need to attack this stuff, I think, and make property available. Then, of course, we have to tackle the very complex issues of matching and getting people into it. But we don't seem to be doing enough to manage that basic housing shortage.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Daniel Sinner. Joining me for a discussion on homelessness is Jad Adams from the homeless charity Night Watch, Anna Page from St Mungo's, Andrew Farris from Rhythms of Life International, and Ken Hurst from TNT Multimedia. Sure, Andrew Farris from Rhythms of Life International. You obviously work with people who are in both in temporary accommodation and hostels, but also the rough sleepers. Do you recognise a housing crisis?
Absolutely, yes, I do. I agree with Ken as well that there is a solution in some way. Is that there are many empty properties, and particularly office properties. You look around London, and they've got vacant signboards everywhere. I think the business should come in and step in, and these are the big corporate companies owning mega buildings. I've seen an increase on our service users on a daily basis. It started at 30, it's now gone up to 50 in 3 weeks. It's 50 people lining up every night waiting for food. In London in 2012, I think that's something to really seriously think about for the government and the ministers, and also the corporate, big company, giant companies. Again, I also agree with the fact that Ken mentioned about the fact that they could go to Norfolk. Well, I think, Ken, maybe we may be a little late on that, because guess what? I think a lot of them already been sent from Hackney and other boroughs, from Newham to Exeter and Swansea and other places, to live there so that they can make our own boroughs look much nicer, that there's less homelessness. And yet the cost is astronomical for each person being moved out of London to be accommodated somewhere else. I'm pretty sure that if all the charities, particularly the housing like ours and St Mungo's and other charities get together, we can actually come up with, I'm sure there's some solutions to be solved. One of our previous meetings we had was with Grant Shapps MP, who's now the chairman of the Conservative Party, at the Homeless Link at the House of Commons. We stated that hopefully, if more charities hopefully work together and try and connect with each other and try and sort out some of the issues that homeless guys are coming in with and the rough sleepers, maybe we try and get that message across to the government.
But, even in London, even in a city, next time just walk around your city or town centre and take a look above the shop fronts and the stock rooms where no one keeps stock any longer, because in modern day retail supply chains, no one stocks anything. Now, there are probably 101 reasons, as Anna says, suitable, available accommodation. Well, that won't be available because lazy landlords would actually far rather put up with a bit of inconvenience of a sleeping bag or a cardboard box in a doorway than they would do something about utilising that space for proper apartment accommodation. I know there'll be excuses. It will range from planning consent and restrictive covenants, fire engine access, the attitude of can't be bothered absentee landlords, all of that. And it just requires the will and the legislation to make that accommodation available.
Jad Adams, what are your thoughts about this tax on empty homes?
I don't think the problem is that there isn't enough accommodation. It's that accommodation is overpriced and to some extent underused, as we've heard earlier. But overpriced we can really do something about. And the real difficulty is that we're paying a huge welfare bill, a huge housing bill of payments to absentee landlords who are in Lagos or Florida or the south of Europe and who are coining this money in. And the government's idea is, let's cut the benefits to the people who are receiving them. What I think should happen is that we should fix the rents as we previously fixed rents before 1989. This isn't the most radical and original idea. We used to fix rents, and we can fix rents again. And the government will say, look, the market must set its own prices. But actually, we are the only people who are paying this housing benefit.
Andrew Farriss from Rhythms of Life International, you recognise the need for finding more space around London which is not used. Your charity looking for more accommodation to create your food packages.
Yes, we have, and we are. What we are doing at the moment is that other than Hackney, it was what we initially started with in Hackney, because being a third poorest borough in the United Kingdom, we've now spread over to Camden. So we have, the project in Camden now is for our rough sleepers to give out food there as well as open a food bank. And we've already moved into Hammersmith. Hammersmith, Fulham, you wouldn't have thought there's a borough that is in need of a food bank for rough sleepers and accommodation. Because, again, I agree with the panel there who are saying that, there are people who are now coming in who live in a temporary accommodation or rented or even owned accommodation. Now they don't have that anymore. They're actually coming in asking for housing advice, welfare advice, benefit advice, because they're out of a job, because they just can't afford it. The rents are far too high. They've set up the level of rents that I don't think anybody can afford unless you work 40 hours a week, 50, 60, 80 hours a week even. I think that the rent thing has to be sorted out anyway by whichever method. However, I have seen an increase. We at the charity Rhythms of Life have seen an increase with homeless community increasing in Hackney, in Camden at the moment, more so in Hammersmith and Fulham. And there's more people coming in now for food parcels.
As we come to the end of this discussion, it's obvious that the London Mayor has missed his target for eradicating rough sleeping by 2012. If I could hear from all of you about what you think the next step is needed for both rough sleeping and those in temporary accommodation. We'll begin with Jad Adams.
The organisation of the councils and the Mayor ought to start engaging much more thoroughly with the faith organisations that have always, and community organisations that have been supporting homeless people in the past and who haven't been brought in to these top-down initiatives.
Andrew Farriss from Rhythms of Life International.
I would say that, yes, definitely government needs more knowledge about the homelessness on the street. They need to be aware of what's really going on the street and bring in charities together as well as the corporate world together. And maybe the corporate world can donate, and, rather than avoiding the tax problems that we've heard in the news recently, maybe they can be helping a lot of the charities in the housing problem, along with the government plans. And I think government plans needs to know from the charities what's required.
And finally, from Ken Hurst, journalist and chairman of TNT Multimedia.
We need to solve the basic vacant accommodation problem. Why don't we start? Why doesn't the government start with choosing one of the difficult areas in London where Jad and Anna and Andrew work, and assess the vacant accommodation situation? Let's have an assessment of how much is out there not being used, which could be utilised to put a roof over the head of the homeless. Then we can start dealing with the problem at that basic level.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for today's discussion. Thank you to all of my guests. Jad Adams from the homeless charity Night Watch, Anna Page from St Mungo's, Andrew Farriss from Rhythms of Life International, and Ken Hurst from TNT Multimedia. So we'll begin with Jad Adams. He's the chair of Night Watch, a charity that works with the homeless in South London. Should we be giving food and money to rough sleepers?
There are a few things that you can say about giving food to people in particular. Giving money is a different matter. Giving money directly to homeless people is something we might want to get onto. But giving food, and that's something I'm certainly very much involved in, and more involved this week than ever before. There's a massive amount of food being donated over the Christmas period. Yes, we've got to give food to homeless people. One of the main things that happens when we're giving food is that we're feeding someone who may not have eaten,
and circumstances to give them help. The government say the National Helpline is an alternative to handouts. In 2009, the London Mayor Boris Johnson said he would eradicate rough sleeping in the capital by 2012. But figures published by the Greater London Authority show the numbers of homeless have been rising sharply, up 43% in 2011 to 2012, compared with the previous year. Meanwhile, according to the homeless charity Shelter, there are now 52,960 homeless households in temporary accommodation. But the most recent figures from the New Policy Institute estimates there are up to 380,000 homeless people in
at all that day. Now, there's no way they're going to address any of their problems, a reconciliation with family members, or their drug problems, or their alcohol problems, or whatever other problems they've got when they're hungry. Because if you're that hungry, then your main focus is going to be simply on that hunger. So the first thing we've got to do with anyone in need is to stabilise them.
Sure. Let's go to Anna Page, policy manager at St Mungo's, a charity which helps the homeless. Should we be giving food and money to rough sleepers?
Well, as Jez already highlighted, it's a really difficult issue. I think it's really important to recognise that people who do give.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. Britain's Housing Minister Mark Prisk has recently said he doesn't believe the public should give money or food to the homeless. He urged the public to put a hand up rather than a hand out. He says people should call the newly launched homeless hotline when they are worried about a rough sleeper. The national hotline, backed by 500 homelessness charities, will then alert local support services about a homeless person's location in England who are effectively hidden because they're staying with friends or family. So, should we give food or money to rough sleepers, or are we just making things worse? And what needs to be done to help homeless households in temporary accommodation? Joining me for a discussion on homelessness is Jad Adams, the chair of Night Watch, a charity caring for the homeless in South London. Anna Page is policy manager at St Mungo's, a charity helping the homeless. Andrew Farris is the founder of the homeless charity Rhythms of Life International and was himself once forced to sleep rough on the streets of London. And Ken Hurst is a journalist and chairman of TNT Multimedia Limited, a magazine publisher.